That's a recap for the class. General overall headings.
We covered pretty much budding. We went through the reproduction in general of prokaryotic and eukaryotic, such as protists, bacteria. We went through fungi, went through animals in general, I think.
Very good, very good. All right, so Nathaniel, I'll start with you. What's the difference between prokaryotic and eukaryotic?
Eukaryotes are more complex cells. They are found in animals and plants.
Good, but we need the definition. You got the characteristics, very good. I like the way you articulated yourself. What is the key thing the examiner wants to know? Anne?
They have membrane-bound organelles.
Perfect, right? Nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. Now, what's very interesting is, yesterday was a very exciting day because my year 12, this was like the 6th or 7th batch of year 12s I've taken, sat the HSC Biology exam. So I'm just hearing from results from them. So hopefully as soon as that paper gets released, I can share the screen and I'll take you guys through what the exam actually looks like. So you know how you need to position yourself to study, what things you need to learn to do well in exactly about 365 days. Now your countdown has started as of yesterday, right? Officially, the 365-day countdown has started. If you guys search HSC exam countdown, if you do that in 1 week, you will see the countdown to your HSC exams. What I did when I was year 12, a long time ago, was I bookmarked that page. So every time I hopped on the internet, that came up. And although it gave you a little bit of anxiety, it pushed me to kind of weigh up the odds of relaxing versus working on the spot. And more than often, I would start by getting into work rather than procrastinating. So do consider little systems like that to help you study. But coming back to this, very good. Prokaryotic versus eukaryotic. Now, we need to know the different kinds of organisms. So how about, Ed, take us through bacteria and protists. What makes them different?
They're both unicellular, but bacteria is prokaryotic and protists are eukaryotic.
Very good.
Right.
Good. All right. And so what else separates them? Which one is a cell wall?
Bacteria.
Very good. And what's a cell wall made out of at all?
Peptidoglycan.
Very good. Protein. Very good. And Sarah, moving on to you, if your mic does work, what kind of reproduction do bacteria do versus protists?
So can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
So one of them does asexual and one of them does sexual reproduction.
Okay. Do you want to define sexual versus asexual for the class?
So in asexual reproduction, one parent is involved, and for sexual reproduction, two parents are involved.
Okay, good, but you need to. This is the other hard thing, right? You learn something with me, you learn something at school. Now I'm biased, but I'm going to tell you this straight away. If you learn something with me, something at school, and if it, doesn't correlate, I'm usually the facts point of view. So you should go with what I mentioned. Now, what did I tell you all about the number of parents story for explaining asexual versus sexual? Anne?
You said that sexual isn't always two parents, because like for flowers, it can be of the same parent, but it can be sexual.
Exactly. So do not fall in the trap. And often they teach you at school, sexual is two parents, asexual is one. That's not correct. The fact is, sexual reproduction, you have variation. That's the one word I want to hear. If I say sexual, you need to say genetic variation, okay? And if I say genetic variation, Alyssa, what cell process gives rise to genetic variation?
Meiosis.
Meiosis, very good, right? So you need to say meiosis produces gametes. Every single gamete is genetically different to the one before and the one after it. And as a result, when gametes combine, every offspring is different, okay? So that's sexual reproduction. It involves meiosis. Asexual reproduction, no variation, no meiosis. Do you see how I never mentioned anything about one versus two parents? Okay, so I would implore you, if you learn something different at school, put your hand up, ask the teacher, question them, because you need to get to the truth of the information. That's what biology is all about. Okay, very good. Good. So I would say let's pass it on to Rithania. Bacteria versus protists. What are the forms of reproduction? So I'm going to say both are asexual, just to start us off.
Binary fission is bacteria,
Good.
and then budding
Or
protists.
good, but also binary fission. Remember,
Yeah.
every new life form can do what the previous life form can do, plus it adds one new form of reproduction. Very good. Now let's move on to fungi. Atul, take us through fungi. What do they look like?
Can't they be asexual and sexual?
Start us off with what they look like, right? In your head, it should always be what do they look like, and then what can they do, right?
They're unicellular and they can be multicellular.
Very good. Okay, keep going.
They have a cell wall made out of, don't remember.
Good. I like that you're not reading off your notes, which I really respect. It's chitin. Okay, good. Keep going. What about the forms of reproduction? Let's go to Matthew. What are the forms of reproduction of fungi, Matthew?
Budding in spores.
Good. So I'm going to say asexual or sexual, and you take the latest form of reproduction from the previous life form. You write it on, and then you're going to add spore formation. And spore formation is what can be asexual or sexual, right? Very good. Let's move on to plants. This is the last one you learned. We haven't spoken about animals just yet. So Anne, take it away. What does a plant look like, and what forms of reproduction can it engage in?
So plants are eukaryotic cells. They have a cell wall. They have like chloroplast and like a large vacuole.
Good.
Can have asexual or sexual reproduction. The sexual one is pollination, and asexual is vegetative propagation, I think.
Very good. Vegetative propagation. Now, if I was asking you at school, Anne, what's the difference between the two? What would you tell me in very basic words? Start with vegetative propagation. What is that?
Vegetative propagation, well, it has no genetic variation. It's clones of like the parents. So, and it's mitosis.
Good.
And pollination is the combination of the two gametes.
Good. So pollen combining with ova, and then you just need to mention the male and reproductive parts, right? So the anther is the male reproductive part, and the female reproductive part is the stigma, style, and ovary. That's it. Now let me ask you a very logical question, right? When would you want a plant to do vegetative propagation? When would you expect a plant to do pollination? So like, what are the pros and cons of each? You see these two reproduction processes in plants. When might a plant want to do vegetative propagation? When might it want to do pollination?
For the vegetative propagation, if it's got like favorable characteristics and it works, like it survives well in its environment, that would be good because it's less likely to die.
Exactly. Very good. Very good, right? And the other thing I will say is vegetative propagation is also low effort, right? So after a natural disaster, if an entire plant, like a whole land gets wiped out by a fire, for example, plants can very quickly regenerate through vegetative propagation. In fact, you might have heard stories where you literally light fire to crops so that they grow better the next harvest cycle. And the goal is it forces the plants to engage in vegetative propagation and make new, stronger plants that have, favorable characteristics. Pollination requires much more energy because you need bees, you need external organisms to come along and transfer pollen in the ova together, but it increases genetic variation. Why is that beneficial, Rithania? Increasing genetic variation.
Would it allow them to survive for longer?
See, you always need to, then I'm good. Biology is literally saying why, right? Whenever someone teaches you anything, bit of an annoying thing to do, but a good biologist, a really good scientist, a really good surgeon or a doctor asks why. Why would the plant live longer, Rithania, if there's more variation?
If there's a variation in the gene, I'm pretty sure they would have.
That's all right. Let's go to Ed. Why would there be more survival or greater likelihood of survival, Ed, if they're in pollination versus vegetative propagation?
Because the favourable traits.
Good.
Well,
Natural selection is exactly the word I'm looking for, right? The favorable traits are more likely to be present because there's more variation in the population, right? If we have a more varied population, and if, let's say, the selective pressure was all the food is at a high altitude, then there's bound to be some tall people that can reach the food, pass on their traits, and continue the species, right? Versus if all the plants were short and they only did vegetative propagation, they'd entirely die out if the environment changed at all. Very good. They will ask you questions like this, right? Discuss features that are advantageous for vegetative propagation versus pollination. So that's quite a high yield question as well. Does anyone have any questions? So we just recapped what we learned last lesson. Before you come to class, this is exactly what you should do. And this is exactly what I do when I'm learning concepts in medicine as well, right? You literally just teach it to yourself on a blank sheet of paper, and if you understand everything, you've got the concept down pat. Move on. Very good. All right. Now we're going to start talking about animals, because that's the organisms that we've missed. So I want you all to go towards page all the way up. Yeah. So in fact, I'll get you guys to answer these. Answer this question for me. Have we already done this question, the NEEP 2019 trial question? No. Okay, go for it. This will teach you why I stressed asexual versus sexual reproduction. When you get your answer, hit the raise hand icon. Good. Good. You guys are doing trial questions. These are meant to be hard. This is like the hardest HSC Biology questions are. And you guys are doing it in seconds, see? So it's very good. Good job. All right. So I will posit the question to Sarah. What do you think? Starting off, what can we cancel out? So with biology, it's always process of elimination. So Sarah, what options can you cancel out looking at this question?
So we can cancel out A.
Very good. Keep going.
And then we can cancel out D.
Very good. Sexual reproduction produces fewer offspring than asexual. This is a hard one, right? Because then if you don't know for sure, use examples. So in my head, I'm going, okay, for sexual reproduction, my example could be animals, right? Animals sexually reproduce. If we're talking about humans, we only make like one offspring every 1 year if we tried every single reproductive cycle, right? Versus asexual reproduction bacteria can double the population in 20 minutes. They reproduce like crazy and they die really crazy as well, right? So they die very quickly, reproduce very quickly, their population can multiply. That's why you can't eat food that's been out for more than a couple of hours, because the bacterial colonies have grown so much they will literally kill you if untreated with a viral gastroinfection, etc. So I would say that's a hard one to say. You can't say that with 100% certainty, because bugs who engage in asexual reproduction divide much faster and make more offspring than humans. That's just my little example, right? So when you come across a question like this, put a question mark. You don't know yet. It's not the best answer, but it's not the worst. Let's move on to B and C. Let's go to Matthew. What do you think about B and C, Matthew?
We can first eliminate C because it's not really an advantage we're looking for. Less complex. It doesn't say anything about whether it's efficient or not. Less complex in terms of what.
Yeah, good. Very good. So then that leaves us with B. Matthew, what do you think about B?
B is 100% correct, because sexual gives genetic variation compared to asexual, which does not have genetic variation.
Perfect, right? So 1B is straight on the ball. So B is the best answer. And the other thing you guys need to not fall into the pitfall of is they will ask you a specific question, right? Which is, what is an advantage of asexual or sexual reproduction? They will give you true statements, right? But they may not answer the question. If that's the case, that option is wrong. They may say something along the lines of protists engage in budding. That's true, but it's not answering the question posited to you. In that case, that option is completely wrong as well. Okay, very good. And here, very quickly, let's go to Rithania. What's your answer to question 2? And the rest of you, hit the raise hand icon once you've got an answer. Good. Good. Nice. Rithania, any ideas?
I thought it was A.
Okay, I would say you're right. What do you think it's A?
I mean, well, we're currently doing module 7, and we kind of looked at yeast in the microscope, and I kind of saw it.
Okay, good. All right, first hand, even better. But the key thing here is this symmetrical or asymmetrical that you see, Rithania, the type of division?
Asymmetrical?
Yeah, right. And I told you budding is an asymmetrical type of reproduction where you form a little bud and little tiny buds grow off that. What they're showing you here, what organelle would that be, Alyssa? If I asked you to label it, that gray organelle. Sorry, I can't hear you. That's all right. The nucleus is that gray organelle. So the answer here would be budding. Very good. All right. Now, very briefly, I want to talk to you all about internal versus external fertilization. So now we moved on to animals. So let me go all the way up, find our section on animals. Okay, good. So this is pretty much the final dot point of this sub-dot point of this first dot point. I told you this dot point is very long, but once we cover it, things will start to go much faster in Mod 5. I also want to preface, guys, Mod 5 Bio is probably the longest module in HSC Biology. So do not fret if we spend more than our anticipated 10 weeks learning Module 5, right? A lot of content. First is Mod 6, which is very short. We can probably finish in 5, 6, 7 weeks max, okay? All right, coming back to this, we're talking about animals. Now, the first thing is, what is an animal? And let me ask you a question that convoluted me when I was in year 12. Is an insect an animal? Ed, yes or no?
Yes.
Yeah, it is, right? Insects are animals as well, so they count. And fish are animals as well. And when you talk about animals, the way the syllabus wants you to break it down is terrestrial animals living on land and aquatic animals, right? Aquatic animals underwater. There is a huge difference between these environments to the point that the environment is controlling the kind of reproduction that's going on, right? Now, let's think about this. You've all seen Finding Nemo, hopefully, right? Hit the raise hand icon if you've seen Finding Nemo. Good. It's must do. It's biology homework if you haven't done it, right? So, in Nemo, the first scene, you'll remember there's eggs, right? How are those eggs formed? Did fish have to mate and then did the egg come out of the female? How did those eggs form? Anyone? Ed, how did those eggs form in Nemo? You should know this.
They're just kind of released by the female.
Good. So unfertilized eggs are released by a female fish, right? And at the same time, another male fish that's swimming around in this vast ocean is going to release its gametes, the somatocytes, right? And then they will combine by ocean currents. Ocean currents will cause them to combine, and then you get little Nemo, little eggs. Now, there was no mating required. Do you all see that? There are always exceptions to this rule. Certain aquatic animals which are large enough will mate. But for the general rule of thumb, fish engage in this kind of reproduction. Now, the thing is, they're underwater. So these gametes, these cells are always hydrated. You'll agree? They will never dry up and they'll never die. Now, you have to appreciate you are 60% water. The reason you're alive is because you have so much water. The inside of your body is always hydrated and all your cells are bathed in an aquatic environment, in water, quite literally. Water plus some calcium, potassium, sodium, etc. Right? What would happen if we tried to do this kind of reproduction on land? What would happen if a male released their sex cells, a female released their sex cells into a terrestrial dry environment like Australia? What would happen to those sex cells? Britannia, what would happen to those sex cells in a terrestrial environment?
They would die out.
They're literally dry and die out. They'll shrivel up and die because all the water will evaporate, right? So then comes this huge issue. How can we allow terrestrial organisms to reproduce? Because if you follow the timeline of evolution, according to evolution and the origin of life, life began underwater, and then eventually we progressed to amphibians, terrestrial organisms, etc., right? So what changed to allow terrestrial organisms to reproduce? How do terrestrial organisms reproduce? We'll go back to Ed. What is terrestrial reproduction? What does that involve? What kind of fertilization?
Internal fertilization.
Very good. Tell us a little bit more about it. Where does internal fertilization occur?
And female reproductive tract.
Very good, right? So the key thing the syllabus wants you to know is aquatic animals engage in external fertilization. Terrestrial animals engage in internal fertilization. And the most common exam question you'll get is compare the pros and cons of each. So all you need to know is a brief description of what external fertilization is, a brief description of what internal fertilization is, and then pros and cons of each. Very logical. You don't have to memorize this stuff, right? So internal fertilization, it occurs in the female reproductive tract, right? Now, you guys are going to become little surgeons right now. I'm going to quickly show you what the female reproductive tract looks like. So let me just pull it up for you. I'm going to show you my artistic skills and we'll do it together. Okay. So what we have, I'll do it in blue. In most terrestrial organisms, this is generally what the reproductive tract looks like. Does anyone want to become an obstetrician or a gynecologist, so a doctor that delivers babies? No? Okay. When you do the rotation, you'll find out whether you really like it or you really don't. There's huge pros and cons to it, but we'll talk about that another time. Okay, I'm going to ask you all what I'm drawing here, right? So this is the vaginal canal. This is the uterus. What is this lower part of the uterus called? How's the name? This is important because all of you got jabbed in year 10 with a vaccine that prevents infection of this lower part of the uterus, which can lead to cancer. What is the name of this lower part of the uterus? We'll go, Ed, I'm going to pick on you again. What's the lower part of the uterus called? Quickly.
So, is that Ed or Anne?
Ed. I'll say Edward. Thanks.
Cervix.
Very good. Right. So cervix is the lower part of the uterus. Does anyone know what this structure is and this structure? So Matthew, what is A and what is B? Any clues?
No idea.
Okay. So B is the ovary. Very interesting. I'll tell you all of it. In fact, all of you are actually born female, right? So you might know females have 2 X chromosomes. Male has an X chromosome and a special Y chromosome. So what happens is when you're inside the uterus in mum's womb, you're all female, and then suddenly at about 10 or 12 weeks gestation, so when you're 10 or 12 weeks old inside the womb, for males, this chromosome activates, and the DNA of that chromosome starts producing a hormone. Now, Anne, what does DNA make? It doesn't make fats, it doesn't make carbs. What's the one thing DNA can produce?
Proteins?
Protein, right? So this Y chromosome starts pumping out a protein hormone, which will then convert the ovaries into testes. The ovaries of a male are the testes of a female. They've just been changed to different positions. The ovaries are inside the abdomen, and the testes drop from the abdomen into the scrotum, right? So interestingly, the male and female reproductive systems are very similar. The only difference is hormones have acted on the female one to convert it into a male one for males, right? So biologically, this is what happens. And in about 1% of children, this doesn't happen completely normal. So if you know 100 friends, at least one of them will have some degree of intersex features, both male/female. Good. Coming back to this, this is an ovary, very similar to the testes. And as you know, the testes make spermatozoa. So what would the ovaries make, Sarah?
The eggs.
Good. The ova. Very good. Now, Atul, what would A be?
Not sure. What does it start with?
It's a tube.
Fallopian tube.
Very good. Fallopian tube. It's also called the oviduct or ovarian tube. I just like to call it fallopian tube, right? So let me just explain to you what happens in internal fertilization, right? A female has normally a 28-day reproductive or ovulatory cycle. It varies, and we'll talk about the variation later, and that's completely normal, but it's usually fixed between person to person. So someone might have a 31-day cycle. They'll usually always have a 31-day cycle unless they take hormonal medication, etc., right? Usually it's about 28 days. Right at the center at 28 days, at day 14 of this cycle, you will get an ova being popped out of the ovary. It'll ovulate. Ovulation is a process of an ova coming out, and it will then go sit in the outer 1/3 of the fallopian tube, patiently waiting. What is it waiting for, this ova? Anyone tell me? Matthew, what would this ova be waiting for? What process?
Insemination.
Very good. Insemination is actually the process of introducing spermatozoa into the reproductive tract, right? So even when spermatozoa are here, that's insemination, right? So artificial insemination is when you use pipettes and it's a bit unethical, but you will be introducing spermatozoa from a male bull to a female cow, for example, right? The word is not insemination I'm looking for. Can anyone tell me what the word is?
Is it fertilization?
Fertilization. Very good. So the spermatozoa, they need to swim all the way from the reproductive tract. So it'll be introduced by a mating usually. And it will travel all the way down here. And the first one to win this race and reach the ova will trigger fertilization. And what do we make in the process of fertilization? Let's go to Sarah. What is the name of the cell that is made in fertilization?
A gamete?
A gamete is each sex cell, has half
a zygote.
Very good.
A zygote.
Very good. A zygote. Okay. Now, eventually, after this, the zygote will then start traveling through the fallopian tube, and it will go and stick into the muscle layer, into the wall of the uterus. And it will grow and grow and grow, and eventually, inside the wall, you will form an embryo, and then after 12 weeks, a fetus, and after 37 to 40 weeks in a human, birth. That is the process. And remember, the key thing you need to understand here, we're going to learn everything later on. I'll go through it again. But the key thing I wanted to introduce to you was internal fertilization. Can you guys appreciate fertilization happened in the entirely water-filled, protected region, which is a female reproductive tract? Specifically, where did internal fertilization happen? Among all of these structures, if I asked you to identify the location of internal fertilization, Matthew, what would you say?
Could be wrong, but endometrium? I'm thinking of something else.
So endometrium is the lining of the uterus, right? So that's up here. That's the endometrium. You're thinking about implantation. So when we said that zygote goes and implants itself into the wall of the uterus, it implants into the endometrium, right? But coming back here, just in this diagram, where did fertilization happen? Someone shout it out.
In the fallopian tube.
Good. Specifically, a strong student would tell me the outer 1/3 of the fallopian tube. that is where internal fertilization happens, right? Now, the next question is, you all perfectly understand internal versus external fertilization. I'm just going to add a few more details, but I'm going to very shortly ask you, what are the pros and cons of each? So start thinking right now, because I'm going to go across and ask each and every one of you, what is a pro, what is a con of each? Okay, the last thing I will tell you, we've got internal fertilization, got external fertilization. Last thing I'll tell you is about external fertilization, right? So for internal fertilization, we needed one ova to be sitting in the fallopian tube, and millions of spermatozoa will travel, and one will combine with the ova, and you will form one zygote. In external fertilization, the male and female fish in that above example there, they don't just release one spermatozoa or one ova. They will release millions into the water, and water currents will do their thing. Many of those spermatozoa and ova will die. Many of the resulting gametes will die, right? As seen in Nemo. Nemo is a perfect example or a case study of what happens in internal versus external fertilization. Good. So the number of gametes is different in internal versus external. Good. So pros, cons. Let's start thinking. Alyssa, do try see if your mic works. If it doesn't work, you may need to leave or rejoin and see, because I do want to ask you questions too. But we'll start with. Oh, Alyssa, does your mic work now?
Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect. Great. Good stuff. All right, we'll start with the tool. So give me a pro or a con of either. You get it easy because you start off.
Internal fertilization protects the fertilized egg.
Internal fertilization protects the egg. Does it just protect the egg, or does it protect the fetus?
The fetus as well.
Yeah, so I would say protection of the zygote, right? One huge pro is protection of zygote in the female reproductive tract. Female reproductive tract. Now, you should not try memorizing. There's going to be a lot of points here, guys. You should not try memorizing it, but when you do enough questions, this stuff will come off the top of your head. Okay? Do not rote learn this stuff. If you know the principles and you think hard in the exam, you will get everything. Maybe remember the number of points, right? Good. Rithania, moving on to you. Pro or con of any?
A pro of external fertilization is you can produce more offspring.
Very good. Okay, so pro is potentially produce more offspring. Offspring. And remember, you have to explain it in an exam. So why is that, Rithania?
Well, if you take your fish example, there is more eggs and they can be fertilized in a faster rate, I guess.
Good. You know, it's kind of like the employee/business owner example, right? And if you're an employee for a company, in life, all of you are going to choose two pathways, the employee or the business owner. If you're an employee, you have much more security and you have much more stability. In internal fertilization, that's what you have. You have the security that you're more likely to produce an offspring. But in external fertilization, you take a bigger risk. You're releasing those gametes into the waterway. So you can either end up with no offspring at all, or you can end up with hundreds of offspring in a reproductive cycle, all varied. So just like an employee versus a business owner, an employee makes a fixed income that slowly progresses. A business owner can make either nothing or a lot of income. Very similar case example here. Good, let's keep going. Sarah, pro or con of each? Any?
So for external fertilization, a con is large quality of gametes is wasted, and for pros is that there's an increase genetic variation.
Increase in gametes wasted. So did you say a pro is increased genetic variation for external fertilization?
Yeah.
So how is that the case? Because when you think about it, right, the gametes are made by meiosis for both of them. Both of them are sexual forms of reproduction. You're completely right that there's increased number of gametes released. There's also increased number of gametes wasted. But I would say in terms of genetic variation, both have equal variation. If you make one, fish offspring versus one animal offspring, and you make a second fish offspring and a second animal offspring, they'll both have a lot of variation between them, right? The only difference is for fish, you either get no offspring or you get hundreds of offspring. The number is a difference. So I would say I wouldn't mention variation here because both of them are sexual, cause variation. Let's go to Alyssa. Any pro, any con?
A con of external fertilization is that there's more exposure to predation and disease.
Very good. Right, so this is kind of elaborating on that point. Increased gametes versus zygotes wasted, and that's due to increased predation, disease, selective pressures generally. They're very good, right? Anne, on to you. More pros and cons.
For external fertilization, a pro could be it requires less energy.
Requires less energy. Why? You always need to elaborate.
Because for like internal fertilization, the mother or like whatever gender it is like growing the baby using their own energy.
Very good. So I was thinking about it different, but you're completely right? And this kind of falls. What you'll realize is the pros of external fertilization are the cons of internal, right? So we're just writing in arbitrary categories, but you might know, for humans especially, the mother is compromised for 9 months. For 9 months, she's immunodeficient, right? So she doesn't have as strong of an immune system. She's physically burdened because you gain about 12 kilos in pregnancy, a lot of it being water weight, amniotic fluid, 3.5 kilos of baby, so you're carried down. They get short of breath because they get all that fluid, and the amount of red blood cells in that fluid stays the same. So their blood cells get diluted. So they can't clot their blood as well. I'm just touching upon the surface, but I'm showing you that in internal fertilization, mothers are significantly compromised, especially in the environment, in the wild, right? They're much more prone to predation. So I would say that there's decreased energy in external fertilization because you require no mating, but I'll put this under a con of internal fertilization. The mother is biologically, physically, whatever you like to say, is physically compromised. Right? If there was a drought, if there was a natural disaster, selective pressures, they're more likely to die first, right? Because they require increased energy and nutrients for the fetus. Okay? Increased energy, nutrients, they're also immunosuppressed. The first point is what you say in your exams. The rest that I'm saying are just additional points, right? They're also immunosuppressed. More prone to disease. Let me ask you all this. There are 2 conditions that mums risk when they give birth or during pregnancy, human mothers. You guys know what those 2 conditions are? I wouldn't expect you to know, but if you do, amazing. So when your mother had you, you risked getting 2 conditions that potentially could have resulted in death. Do you guys know what conditions I'm talking about? Immunosuppressed or prone to disease. The first one is very high blood pressure. Right? What happens is when the fetus implants into the uterine wall, it releases hormones, and those hormones can cause very high blood pressure, can damage the fetus, damage growth, and also damage mum. Such high blood pressure can cause stroke, it can cause liver problems, brain problems, heart problems. It's called preeclampsia. Can you hit your hand or raise your hand if you've heard of preeclampsia before? Very good. I'd never heard of preeclampsia until I went into medicine. So for those who've heard of it, amazing. It's very high blood pressure that causes organ damage during pregnancy. And the other one is diabetes. Mums also risk getting diabetes because we were parasites in the womb. You and I, we were parasites. What we did was we released hormones to leach all the glucose and sugar from mom's bloodstream into our bloodstream so we can grow. In the process, mother's blood sugar raises very high, and very high blood sugar can cause kidney problems, kidney failure, visual problems, heart attack, so many problems, right? And the last thing that mothers risk themselves is during birth, they risk a very small chance of bleeding to death. That's one of the leading causes of death during birth, especially in developing countries. So I'm just trying to set the scene here that pregnancy is scary. There are a lot of complications that can occur, and if not monitored, things can go wrong. Any other pros or cons? Matthew?
Higher reproductive success rate for internal fertilization.
Very good.
As it's within a homeostatically regulated environment with, let's say, constant pH, constant temperature, and all that. Yeah.
Good. Increased reproductive success rate of the zygote. So once the zygote is formed, a zygote in terrestrial reproduction or internal fertilization is much more likely to go on to birth versus external fertilization, because that zygote or egg will just be sitting in the water, prone to predation, disease, etc. It's kind of we're saying the inverse of this, right? Good. Does everyone know what homeostasis is? At all? In very simple words, what's homeostasis?
I'm not really sure. Is it like a balance of chemical processes?
Yeah, look, break down the words. In science, always try breaking down the words, right? Homeo reminds you of homo, which means homogeneous or same or constant, right? Stasis means state. When something's in stasis, it's non-changing. So homeostasis means always constant. It's talking about the internal body always being constant. Your body temperatures are always 36.5 to 37 unless you have a fever, in the case of disease. Your blood pH is always 7.35 to 7.45. Anything outside that range, and you can die, right? In fact, we as doctors, when anyone's really sick, we measure their blood pH because it tells us how sick someone is. That's what homeostasis is, internal balance. Can you all just write that down? Because homeostasis is such a big part of Module 8, which is non-infectious disease. In fact, disease itself, the definition of disease is a disruption of homeostasis. When internal balance gets disrupted, you get disease, right? Example being if your blood glucose levels are not less, if they're greater than 7 millimoles per liter, we diagnose that as diabetes. Too high, that's a disease, right? Good. Do we have any questions? Any other pros or cons we can think of before I add in some others? But I think we've got most of them.
Like you said before, the opposites for internal are like the opposites. So for internal, a con could be that you need to find a mate, like you need a mate.
Right. So there's increased energy. So going back down there. Yeah. So technically the inverse. There's increased energy because we need nutrients for the fetus. There's also increased energy and the risk of injury. That's another thing they often write in exam answers, the risk of injury to the organisms in mating. Example, I remember watching National Geographic and seeing male and female spiders mate, and the female spider would eat the male spider. And you see that with the praying mantis as well. I think they decapitate the male mantis, which is interesting, that in different species, mating is life-threatening. So adding that is pretty important as well. Very good. Good job. All right. Good stuff, guys. That's most of it. Any questions? Good. Well, congratulations. You finished the first hefty dot point. Does anyone have any questions at all about internal, external fertilization, etc.? Here is my flowchart that I already included in your notes, right? But we went through more or less everything. Good. Have a look at it in your own time. Okay, I'd like you to do checkpoint D for homework. So I'm just going to type this in our chat function too. Week 2. This is week 3, sorry. Week 3, checkpoint D, which is on page 33. And I'd like you to keep going all the way to checkpoint. You guys can do all these questions too. All of this. So also checkpoint E. Then we'll move on, we'll keep going to. We'll also do checkpoint F. I have questions. So checkpoint F as well. We'll come to this. Then checkpoint. Very good. All right, now this next dot point is very hefty. So what I'm going to do is for the next 10 minutes, we're going to go through the theory before we start the dot point. So defining this dot point here, which is analyzing fertilization, implantation, hormones, pregnancy, and birth. As you can see, this is a hefty dot point. And it's probably one of the hardest dot points for Module 5. I don't want you guys to get discouraged when I say hard. When I say hard, I just mean there's a lot of concepts that you need to just focus to understand. It'll all be fine. So what I'll do is we'll define this dot point. I'll give you a 5-minute break, and then we will actually jump into hormones, which is a whole other story. Now, small point, I think, Alyssa, your Teams didn't work, so during the break, just stay back and we'll figure out your Teams access. Okay, good. All right, can I get someone to dumb down and tell me, what does this dot point mean? What does analyze mean, Tul? You see a question in your HSC exam which says analyze X. What are you going to be doing?
Can you just give the pros and cons?
That's discussed, right? They wouldn't have a whole other English word. They meant the same thing. But good effort. I like that you thought about exam technique and verbs. What does it say in your glossary of verbs? I told you to print that out, put it on your wall, because otherwise biology is always going to be confusing because you'll always lose 1 mark or 2 in every single long response question, right? So if someone's got the verb list in front of them, tell me, what does analyze mean? Identify something and then draw. Someone read it out for us.
Identify components and the relationship between them, draw out and relate implications.
Good. So in very simple terms, it means identify components and draw relationships. That's what analyze means, right? So you should all be writing this down because analyze is a common exam long response verb that you get. Identify components and then draw relationships. I thought this was still too fluffy. Well, what the heck does that mean? Identify components, draw relationships. What are components, right? So in simple terms to me, analyze means define and explain the key concepts and then go into detail into how they link to one another. So for a question like this, you would need to define / explain what fertilization is, implantation is, pregnancy and hormonal control, and then link them together. So in my head, very briefly, I'm thinking, well, the link between fertilization and implantation is implantation happens about 1 week after fertilization, and it's when the zygote or the embryo sticks into the muscle wall of the uterus that I showed you above. That's the link. Hormonal control. Then I will need to talk about how those hormones in pregnancy, like estrogen, progesterone, control that process happening, how they change. That's a link, right? And then pregnancy and birth, I need to talk about hormones in pregnancy and birth. That's literally what this dot point is about. Does that make sense to everyone? Define / explain things and then link them together. What's the relationship between them? Okay, good. So you know what analyze is? Let's start with what is fertilization, what is implantation? And I think the first thing we need to actually define is this last word here, because you're not talking about insects. We're not talking about reptiles. We're not talking about birds. What are mammals? What unites mammals? Without looking at this theory, a mammal. Just when I say mammal, Alyssa, what do you straight away think?
They can produce milk.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, all mammals can produce milk, and that's because they have mammary glands. They have glands underneath breast tissue, especially the female counterpart. Interesting, males can get breast cancer too, right? So male humans. So both animals have breast tissue to some degree that can be acted on by hormones, but it's just females have more, and they have mammary glands that are active and can make milk. But let me just tell you some interesting stuff, right? As soon as a baby is born, mom starts making milk. Before baby is born, the mother does not produce any milk. Hormones control that on and off switch, which is what we're going to be studying later, right? So that's what this whole dot point is about. What happens inside in the female, biologically, hormone-wise, that so tightly regulates this entire process of pregnancy, birth, breastfeeding, etc. Good. What are some other features of mammals? So Alyssa's very nailed the point, which is mammary glands, milk is one key feature of mammals. Ruthania, what's another common feature you think of? Just look at yourself. You are a mammal. What do you have that's similar to bears, squirrels?
I was thinking live birth.
Pardon?
Live birth.
Live birth, yeah. Yes, most of the time, right? There's examples like the platypus, which is it's a monotreme, an egg-laying mammal, a bit weird. But yeah, usually they'll give birth, they'll have live birth. There's one more. So under mammals, we also have fur. So the key things I'm thinking of is we make milk, we have fur/hair, and we can control our body temperature, right? The chemical reactions in our body are happening fast enough that they make enough heat to keep us at the same temperature, despite whether I put you in Greenland, where it's extremely cold, or West Africa, where it's extremely warm. Those are the three things I'm looking for, okay? Now, even under mammals, there's different types. There's marsupials, placentals, monotremes. You don't need to be an expert on this stuff. What is a placental mammal? The name is telling you. What is a placental mammal? Matthew?
Isn't it when the embryo is in the placenta, which means it completes embryo development in the mother?
Yes, very good. I just simplified even more, right? Placental mammals have a placenta, right? They can create a placenta. This is a cool thing about a placenta. There is no other type of mammal that can create a whole organ at a random part in their life, right? Just think about this. A woman during 9 months of pregnancy creates a placenta, which is like this big. It's humongous, right? It's got blood vessels all through it. It looks very weird when you've actually seen it in operating theater, but it's a whole organ that's made just during pregnancy to help nutrient exchange, to provide a barrier between mom's immune system and mom's bloodstream and baby's immune system and baby's bloodstream. Because remember, the baby is half the father, right? And so the mom's immune system thinks the baby's a foreign object, like a bug, like a bacteria, and it will attack it unless that placenta is there blocking off mom's blood from baby's blood, right? So the placenta does a lot of things, but placental mammals have a placenta. Monotremes, egg-laying, marsupials, pouch. That's all I want you to remember. I'm not going to ask you any more except what makes up a mammal and what do we mean by placental mammals. Very good. Let us now take our break, okay? So you'll have a break till about 2:15. In the meantime, sorry, 3:15. So feel free to take your break, go stretch, get some water, recap, and I think, Alyssa, if you're there, are you able to access Teams at all? Is it working for you?
No.
Let me go and let me show you like our channel and This is our channel. When I go to manage members, and members, you're part of the team. You're logged in via this account too. How about I tag you, right? And see if you can access the tag, which will take you into the team.
Yep.
Okay. Good. Let me know if you receive the tag. Click on the tag. It'll take you to the team, and then you can choose to pin the team channel too.
I don't think I got anything.
Let me see if there's another email attached to add members. I will add your guest email as well and see if that works. Too, if you'd like. Okay. Did you receive any?
Yeah, I think it was my guest email that worked.
Okay, right. So maybe you'll have to use your guest, but that's a little bit weird. Did you get the login details for the actual Teams account that I created for you?
I did, but I don't think it worked. Like, I couldn't get it to work.
So you couldn't log in via that account?
Yeah.
Oh, why is that? So you got the username and password. When you use it and log in with that, it should give you an option to change your password. And then you should be able to log in. If you like, I can give you the login details. Again, look what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove you from the team by this. Then I'll add you again. See if that gives you access. Okay. If that doesn't work, I'm just going to have to send you your login details again and then try logging in. Okay. Sure. All right. Take your break, and I will see you all in a couple, 2 or so minutes. Okay. All right, when we're back, can you all hit the raise hand icon? Okay. Another thing is, for notes, all of your parents should have gotten a Google form to specify what notes they'd like, how they'd like to access it. I might have also put it up on the Teams channel, but could you maybe just inform them to complete that form and get back to me? So then I will post most of your notes to you. I think postage would be the best plan, guys, unless you're happy to come anytime to the city, or yeah, it's quite literally the only place we can go, because hospital will also be challenging. So yeah, just fill out that form, put your address in, what you'd like. Does anyone have any questions about notes and obtaining it? There's two things. Yes, Matthew, question?
I just said I couldn't access the Teams form link or the Teams in general. You know,
You can't access Teams as well. Oh, that's because you're not on this. Let me add you now. Sorry about that. Thanks for finding. Sorry. Ah, it's weird. Why is it not showing you? That's all right. No worries. Just remind me after class, Matthew. I'll add you in the channel too. Okay. Cool. All right. Cool. Now, are you all ready to get through the challenging part, right? This is the hormones and pregnancy. So I will need your 100% focus for the next 40 minutes. Then we'll be done with this dot point.
About the notes that are to be posted, what's the difference between those and the ones that we were sent to our emails?
So the module or the theory booklet are the notes. So what I'm showing you right now and showing on my screen is the theory booklet. So you're all just getting the physical copy to write on top of, etc. The other thing that you will get is a printed version of all the exam questions from the new syllabus, about 2019 onwards, trial questions that I collated for Module 5. That's a huge help, because otherwise you guys don't get much access to Mod 5 specific trial questions. Let me show you the Mod 5 trial questions, right? It's this, which is literal non-stop questions for you to just keep on doing. The goal is, by the end of Mod 5, you should have done all these questions, and if you can do all these questions, you're easily getting a Band 6 in Mod 5 Biology. Right?
Yep.
All the questions. Yeah, good.
Do we have to collect them every term, like every time we start a new module?
Every 10 weeks, yes, that's right, every 10 weeks.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
No worries. Okay, let's come back to this.
Sorry, is those trial questions at the end of the theory booklet, or is that like a separate?
It's at the end of the theory booklet. It's attached for chemistry, but it's a separate one for bio. It's just I haven't collated it for bio. That's the only reason. They should be collated, but then it just makes biology extremely thick, because it'll be about 230 pages just for one module. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, actually 300 pages, I think, if you add up the 175 notes and then 115 pages of questions. Good. All right, let's jump into this. So skip all of this stuff. This is just a much more detailed image and visualization of what's going on for fertilization, implantation, etc. So let's go back to the keywords of that document, right? Keywords are fertilization, implantation, pregnancy, and birth. So let's go and define those words too. We've defined mammals. Again, fertilization happens about 1 to 2 days after ovulation. Now, what did we say about ovulation? How long is a normal female reproductive cycle? At all?
weeks.
28 days, right? 28 days. You need to go days wise, because it needs to be that accurate. 28 days, and at exactly day 14 of that 28-day cycle, you get ovulation. 1 day after that, if there has been mating, and if there are functional spermatozoa that can actually travel all the way through the vaginal canal, the uterus, and reach the fallopian tube, you'll get fertilization. They've written day 0 here to represent this is the first day in which the pregnancy has technically started, right? But don't worry about the days, that's not too important. So just remember the relative days. So 1 day after ovulation is fertilization. We form our zygote. And how many days after fertilization do we get implantation, which is what you see here? Interpret this diagram and tell me, guys. How many days after fertilization does implantation happen?
8 to 9.
Yeah, on average, it's about 1 week later, so 7 days, right? Day 8 to 9, 7 to 9 days. Okay. Now, in that process, when I was studying this the first time, I was very confused as to what is an embryo, what is a fetus, what is a baby, when do I use these terms, right? So let me help you out with this. What you see happening immediately as this zygote is traveling through the fallopian tube is rapid mitosis. Can you all see that? It's divided into 2, that divides into 4, and there's an exponential growth to the number of cells. Don't worry about the word morula. Morula is just a clump of cells. That's what it means. Not important for your HSC syllabus. When you start, have a look at what's happened between this stage and this stage, right? What happens is this ball of cells goes and condenses in the corner here. And everything outside of that clump of cells is fluid. We call that blastocele, right? Since there's fluid now, the name changes from morula to blastocyst. Again, this is out of the scope of the syllabus. The only reason I'm teaching it to you, so when you see it, you go, I've heard of this word before. I generally know when in pregnancy this is occurring. Okay, you don't need to memorize this stuff. Just vaguely listen. At this point, once you've formed a cluster of cells, once you see that's a blastocyst, you can start calling it an embryo. Okay, an embryo. Now, how long is a normal pregnancy for humans? It's different for different organisms. And any clues?
9 months, so it's like 37 to 40 weeks, I think.
Very good. 37 is the green ballpark. It's exactly where we ideally want a pregnancy to be, right? 37 weeks. Now, from weeks 1 to 12, you call it an embryo. At week 12, by week 12, all the organs have formed. And it actually starts looking like a baby versus an alien, which is what an embryo looks like. Have you all seen an embryo? Google search it right now. A chicken embryo, a fish embryo, a human embryo all look very, very similar, right? That's the study of comparative embryology. That points to why we could have all been from a common ancestor. That's what you all learned in year 11. But coming back to this, embryo until week 12, 12 weeks onwards, it's a fetus, okay? And then when it's born, you can call it a newborn, right? Baby is a very layperson term. No doctor will say, we don't often use the word baby. So in your answers, try to call it either an embryo or a fetus or a newborn, okay? Good. Any questions so far? Good. So day 14 ovulation, 1 day after is fertilization, 7 days after that, we get implantation. Now, here are some terms that you might have heard. Now, this is the wall of the uterus. Now, what are the different layers of tissue? What are the different kinds of tissue? There's 4 different tissues that make up the human body. You guys learned this in module 2, organization of living things. Alyssa, do you want to give it a go? I'll give you one example. We have epithelial cells that line surfaces. What's another kind of tissue, Alyssa?
Like muscles.
Very good. Muscle tissue. Does anyone know any other types of tissue? Give you a hint, you're using it right now to think. Neurotransmitters are being released. Nervous tissue. Very good.
Connective.
Very good. Connective tissue, muscle tissue, epithelial tissue, nervous tissue. That's the 4 different tissue types, right? So when we talk about the wall of the uterus, there is a layer that's at the very front. Let me draw it in pink so it all fits in, right? So there's lining cells at the very surface. They're a type of epithelial cells. But for the uterus, we call it the endometrium. And you're going to have to start using this word in your exam answers. So implantation happens into the endometrium. This endometrium is juiced up. It looks like jelly, quite literally. It's juiced up in glucose, water, and nutrients. So this embryo can tap into those nutrients and grow rapidly over 37 weeks into a 3.5 kilo mass we call a baby. Underneath that is the muscle layer. For muscle, you'll often hear the word myo in medicine to describe muscle, right? Myonecrosis is death of muscle tissue. Rhabdomyolysis is breakdown of muscle. Myo means muscle. Myometrium is a muscle layer underneath. And that's what the fetus and embryo will further invade into, because that's where all the blood vessels are. Okay, good. Just a few words that you'll commonly be dealing with. Good, let's move on. Any questions before I move on? At all? Please ask away.
Is the myometrium, is that only, is that the layer behind the endometrium or just all muscle tissue?
Yes, so it's the layer right underneath, specifically the endometrium. So it's only for the uterus we're talking about. Okay, so from here to here. Yeah, that muscle layer.
Thank
Good. You also have some connective tissue at the back. Again, this is all way outside the syllabus. So the key thing you guys need to be able to mention in your answers is endometrium. Even myometrium is not important. It's the endometrium, which is a lining of the uterus. Okay, good. If you see the word endometrium, remember that's where implantation happens. Not fertilization, not ovulation, implantation. Very good. Yeah, you guys can do these practice questions too. Now let's move on. Let's talk about hormones. Does anyone know what an endocrinologist does? Endocrinologist. Specialist. The ex-head of NSW medicine, he was an endocrinologist. So what do they deal with? Any clues?
The endocrine system.
Very good, right? Now, what is the endocrine system, Ed? There's two parts to it, if you break it down.
Like hormones.
Yes. Where do those hormones come from? What do we call those structures that release hormones?
Glands.
Very good. So all the glands in the body and the hormones they release are collectively called the endocrine system. Now let me ask you this, zooming out, what kind of diseases would an endocrinologist deal with? I'll give you a hint. An endocrinologist deals with the most common disease or the most common cause of death for human beings on this planet. What disease am I talking about? It's a silent disease. You don't get any symptoms until it's too late. Your kidneys will fail, you'll go blind, you won't be able to feel, so your nervous system, your sensation drops. You have a high risk of getting silent heart attacks, heart failure.
Diabetes?
Yes, diabetes is scary because lay people don't feel it, right? You feel a heart attack, so people come to the hospital. You feel heartburn, you feel when you got a blood clot in your chest, but you will not feel diabetes. It's just high sugar in your bloodstream, and it's so toxic that it damages those blood vessels. You damage blood vessels to the kidney, you get kidney failure. Getting kidney failure is worse than getting cancer, right? Because you'll be waiting in the list to get a transplant, and people often die on that list. People don't realize how scary diabetes really is. So it's just hopefully you guys are learning to understand that now. Diabetes is the most common endocrine disease because hormones control blood sugar, and when those hormones go whack, you will get type 1 or type 2 diabetes. We'll talk about that more in Mod 8, but for now, as long as you can appreciate what an endocrinologist is. Let's talk about hormones. What is a hormone? I know it's written here, but I want you to, if anyone studied it already or at school, in your own words, if you were to ask or help a friend out, what would you say a hormone is? Let's go to Matthew. Matthew, have you learned about hormones yet at school?
No.
Okay, that's all right. Let me start by teaching you guys hormones, right? So hormones are what we call chemical messengers. The way I think about this is we communicate via sound waves. Cells and organs in your body communicate not by sound waves, but by chemicals. That's how they talk to one another, right? If your blood glucose is too high, your pancreas will talk to your muscles, to your liver, telling them to store that sugar, store it away to lower that glucose. And the way it does that is it releases insulin, right? So hormones are kind of like the language of the human body. They're chemical messengers. They send signals between organs and tissues. So the key word I want you to highlight or underline or write is chemical messenger. If you say that to me, you know what a hormone is. Okay? Now, generally what they do is they will travel in the bloodstream. So let's say you have a gland, right? This is just a general gland. I'm just drawing it. I'll tell you what glands are very shortly. They're these structures that release hormones. They release hormones, and they often will go travel in the bloodstream. Remember, the bloodstream goes very fast, right? It pumps all the way from your heart to your head to the ends of your fingertips, all the way back again and again and again. How many times a minute? 60 to 100 times per minute. That's how much the blood circulates around you, right? It's like an express highway, like those Japanese bullet trains. So this hormone is going to travel from that organ through the bloodstream to another distant organ, whether it be the liver, whether it be the kidneys, whether it be the heart, right? Any organ. And it will tell that organ to do something. The way it does that is it travels in the bloodstream, and it will go very close to that organ, and it will bind to receptors that are on the surface of that organ. And when it binds to receptors are kind of like keys and locks. So this hormone's like a key, goes in a travel, and it binds to a lock on that organ, and it will unlock it, and that will cause the organ to do something. The organ might release more of a hormone, it might absorb something, it may release something, it will do some kind of action. Okay? That's how hormones work. So key thing I want you to write now is travel in the bloodstream, or you can highlight that. Very important. Travel in the bloodstream. Okay? Now the last question is, what are hormones made out of? What is this black circle that I've drawn made out of? Ed, what are the 3 things that a hormone could be, Ed? I know you've learned about this already at school.
Was it lipids, proteins, or
what are proteins made out of, guys? What's the single unit that binds together to make a protein?
nucleotides.
Amino acids, right? So a hormone can be any one of the 3, right? It can be a protein, it can be a fat, which is what a lipid is. It can be an amino acid. Let's go through some examples. You got to really visualize this one, right? Can anyone think back to a time where they literally feared for their life? I can't really think of one except for roller coasters, or maybe I remember being on a safari once and I saw a tiger or a lion that was very close to the vehicle. Immediately, what happens to you when you see a life-threatening stimuli at all? What happens to the hairs on your skin? What happens to your pupils? What happens to blood flow in the body?
It like overstimulates.
Your hairs raise, right? Your pupils dilate so you can see further, so you can identify threats. Muscle goes from your rest and digest structures like your gut, where you're breaking down food, to your muscles so you can fight or you can run. All of that is controlled by an amino acid hormone called adrenaline, right? And adrenaline is released. Let's show you the endocrine system. Do you see these little hats on top of the kidneys? Kidneys look pretty cute. They look like little French artists. On top of them, they have these little hats. And these hats release adrenaline. The next time you crap your pants when you're on a roller coaster or you're seeing a life threat, realize what your body's actually doing. The nervous system stimulates those glands, and the gland will release adrenaline that will travel in your bloodstream everywhere and cause those changes. Right? Another example of a hormone, insulin. If you have too high of a blood sugar, right? Let's say you just went to McDonald's and you smashed 2 burgers, right? You ate so much food, your sugar in your blood spikes. Your pancreas here is going to be releasing insulin, which is not just one amino acid, it's a chain of amino acids called a protein. And that travels in your bloodstream and it takes the sugar out of the blood where it's useless and it puts it into cells whose mitochondria use that sugar to make ATP energy. Has anyone been in a food coma before? Hit the raise hand icon. I'll explain to you what a food coma is. No one? Okay, well, I must be the only one who eats a lot. When you go in a food coma, what happens is your blood sugar is so high that your pancreas releases so much insulin that all that sugar comes rushing out of the bloodstream into cells, and your blood glucose becomes very, very low. And your brain detects that as very low sugar, and you feel very sleepy and drowsy. That's what a food coma is. Cool. Let's talk about the final hormone, lipids. This is the most important one for you. What's an example of hormones in pregnancy? Who's learnt this dot point already? Can you just hit the raise hand icon? No, Ed has. Anyone else? Okay, it's all right. We're going ahead of school, which is good. Ed, what are some examples of hormones in pregnancy? Just give me names.
LH or luteinizing hormone.
Start off with the most important ones, Ed. The most important ones.
Estrogen and progesterone.
Very good. And Ed, what's the hormone that bodybuilders might use to inject themselves with to gain muscle mass?
Testosterone.
Yes, that is not a hormone in pregnancy, but it's a hormone in the male and reproductive and female reproductive system, right? And testosterone comes from fat as well. In fact, lipid hormones all come from cholesterol. It's one of the good uses of cholesterol. Cholesterol is used to make testosterone, progesterone, and estrogen. So sometimes a little bit of cholesterol is important in the diet. Good. Any questions about hormones in pregnancy? You so far only need to know what a hormone is, where it travels, and just the 3 categories of hormones. You don't need to have examples like I've given for you here. This is just so you can appreciate why you're learning this. Okay, final question, because this is important, and this can help you save a life no matter if you do medicine or not. If your friend has anaphylaxis, okay, they ate a peanut, and now they can't breathe, their throat is swelling up, they're about to die in a couple of minutes, what hormone do you inject into their outer thigh?
Adrenaline.
Very good, right? So you should see there'll be an EpiPen. It'll be like a little pen that looks like this, and there'll be an orange end. That orange end has the needle. You will jab that orange end. You'll take the cap off and jab that orange end to the outer thigh, and you will save a life if you do that, right? So adrenaline, it's very important. And the way that works is when you get anaphylaxis, your throat swells up. Adrenaline makes those blood vessels tiny again, so that decreases swelling and allows them to breathe. And it happens within minutes. Like I said, adrenaline gets blood from your non-vital structures like your guts, your throat, and to your muscles. And so we use that knowledge to save lives in anaphylaxis. Good. All of this is just further information. We'll skip all of that. Important. Okay. Here's just an image showing you how hormones are working. Okay. So what you all can see is a hormone is traveling the bloodstream. It goes to an organ and it binds to a receptor. The receptor will be here. Once it's bound to that receptor, it then gets taken in and it travels through the nuclear pore into the nucleus and it binds to DNA. And when it binds to DNA, it changes the amount of protein that DNA makes. Does anyone know any examples of proteins that are important for the human body? Can someone just shout it out? And what are some proteins you know that are important for the human body?
Is glucose one?
Glucose is a sugar, so it's a carbohydrate. Does anyone know any proteins? What protein makes up muscle? Ed, back to you because you've learned this. No.
Yeah, not sure.
Actin and myosin. Those are the 2 proteins that make up muscle tissue. So in the case of testosterone, right, the reason that bodybuilders inject this stuff, even though it's so bad for you, can cause cancer, so many problems. All that testosterone gets converted to estrogen, which can give you all sorts of issues. This testosterone will go and bind to DNA, and it will increase the amount of actin and myosin protein that is expressed or made in muscle tissue. So the muscle gets larger in size. That's quite literally what testosterone does. People who go to the gym, they mimic this by training and tearing muscle fibers, and your body regenerates that by increasing actin and myosin, right? So the last thing I want to just really stress here is that hormones are all in very, very tight balance. If you increase a hormone artificially too much, or you decrease a hormone too much, you get disease. Diabetes is a perfect example of this, right? When you have too little insulin, you're not making any insulin in the pancreas, that's type 1 diabetes. If you're making too much insulin because you eat too much sugary food, the body stops responding to that insulin, and that's type 2 diabetes. Okay, so just really highlighting here, hormones, chemical messengers travel in the bloodstream, need to be tightly regulated, and this is how they act. They change the amount of protein that genes express. You can read this in your own time. I've already spoken about that. Does anyone know people with diabetes? Yeah, it's very common among the Asian population, right? East Asian, less so, but more South Asian populations have a high genetic risk of diabetes. Good. All right. Any questions so far? Okay. Now, what were the 3 things I said about hormones that you must remember? Let's go to Alyssa. What was one important thing you learned about hormones?
That they can be made of protein, cholesterol, or amino acid.
Good. Sarah, what's another thing you learned about hormones?
The chemical messengers.
Good. Britannia, what's another thing?
That they travel through the bloodstream.
Good. Atul, what's another thing? I'm looking for one specific thing. You're doing very good. Good. Keep going. Atul, your turn. Another point about hormones.
I don't know. Everything I know has been said.
What's the last thing I mentioned? They need to be. And what's the fun thing? Yes, good, right? So now what we're going to talk about is how hormones are regulated within a very tight control. So you can see a bunch of glands here, right? You can see the adrenal glands, there's hats in the kidneys, you can see the pancreas, which has glands inside of it that release hormones. There's your thyroid gland here. Women often get thyroid disease. We're not going to talk about that today. But the master controllers of all of these hormones are these 2 structures in the brain. So what you're actually seeing, I want you to visualize this, right? Anatomy is all about visualizing. So all you future surgeons in this chat, this is where you need to really pay attention. What you're looking at here, I want you to imagine if somebody sliced right through the center of someone's head and they looked at it from the side view. That is what you're seeing here, right? This is exactly, it's like a split right in the center, cut through of the brain. And right in the center of the brain, here, is this space in the center of the brain called the hypothalamus. Now, it does a lot of things. The 2 things you need to know for the HSC is very important in homeostasis. It receives all signals and controls your blood. It controls your body temperature, etc. The other thing the hypothalamus does is it releases hormones. Okay? And what those hormones will do is they will go, instead of traveling really far in the bloodstream, they'll travel in the bloodstream, but they'll just go right here to this sac-like structure underneath the hypothalamus called the pituitary gland. I need you all to be saying this. If you don't say the word hypothalamus or pituitary out loud, you're going to forget it by the end of the lesson. So say, the hypothalamus is a main master controller of hormones. It releases hormones that will then travel to the pituitary gland and cause it to release hormones, right? Hormones. And then finally, the pituitary gland will release hormones that will travel in the bloodstream and control the amount of hormones that the thyroid releases, control the amount of hormones that the adrenal glands can release, control the amount of hormones that are released in the ovaries, and the amount of hormones released in the testes. So what you're seeing is how hormones are controlled in the human body. It starts at the hypothalamus, releases hormones that will travel to the pituitary. They release hormones that then act on various other glands throughout the body. Does that make sense to everyone? Good, very good. Let's move on. Move on to okay, so just another image of the all right, so let's talk about very briefly. I'm going to give you guys about 2 minutes. Don't give me a full answer to this. I want you to just off the top of your head have a verbal answer ready. I'm going to briefly ask you all the answer to these questions. Hit the raise hand icon once you've just got a brief answer to question 1 and question 2. Okay, let's start with Matthew. So 3 classes of hormones, Matthew.
Is it the amino acids, lipids, and proteins?
Very good, right? And Anne, actually, I think Anne answered a lot. Sarah, moving on to you. Where do hormones come from? So this relates to the 3 classes. How are they transported and how do they act usually?
So it starts from the pituitary gland and then it travels through the bloodstream of the body.
Yeah, so you could say hormones are released by glands. I'd just say in general, hormones are released by glands. I'd say the lipid hormones are made from cholesterol. The protein hormones are produced from protein synthesis in ribosomes, right? Etc. And the amino acid hormones come from diet because we eat amino acids. Very good. And what about the transport route? Let's go to Rithania.
Do we just say through the bloodstream or do we say from the hypothalamus?
So transport route would be bloodstream. That's how all hormones will transport from one structure to another. Very good. The mechanism of action, let's go to Ed. What's the mechanism of action of hormones?
The hormones bind to a receptor and start the signaling in the cell response.
Very good. That's all you need to say for HSC. They alter cell signaling, right? So they can increase protein synthesis, etc. That's just one example. Very good. Now let's talk about structures in pregnancy in a little bit more detail. So now I'm going to zoom in further and tell you what structures in pregnancy are releasing hormones, right? Now, Matthew, what did I say was the equivalent of the testes in the female?
The ovary.
Very good, right? So, okay, this is what you're seeing. This is an ovary. Now, if I zoom in under a microscope and I see an ovary, this is exactly what I can observe, right? So do you guys see these follicles inside the ovary? Those contain the ova. So under a microscope, this is a fluid-filled follicle, and right in the center of that follicle is an ova. Okay, and what you're seeing here are multiple mini follicles peppered all throughout that are yet to develop, mature, and be ready to be released. So these mature follicles are ready to be ovulated, right? These follicles are almost ready, and these are hundreds and thousands of follicles that are yet to be released. Now, I'm going to zoom in even further to one follicle. This is a zoom in into one mature follicle, right? So you see the ova that's about to be released, that gets released on day 14 of the ovulatory cycle. What you can also appreciate is there's a cluster of cells around the follicle. Can you all see that? These are hormonally active cells. These cells are going to be releasing hormones. Hormones in pregnancy, hormones in birth, etc. Right? Now, the two most important hormones that are released by the ovary, that are released by these cells that line a follicle, talk about what they do very soon, but these are the two most important hormones. If you forget everything else today, for hormones in pregnancy, you need to know what these two hormones do. Estrogen and progesterone. Those are the two most important hormones. Okay, good. And where are they released from? The ovary, the ovarian follicle. Good. Do we have any questions so far before I explain in a bit more detail? Okay. Can anyone tell me when does a female have the most ova in their lifetime? Is it during puberty? Is it during birth? Is it before birth? Is it during menopause?
Yeah.
It's actually before birth. So at about 20 weeks inside the womb, a female has the most ova that they will ever have in their lifetime. And then what happens is as you age, as you get older, a lot of the ova will degenerate and die because of radiation from the sun, from chemical mutagens, from food we eat, carcinogens, etc. Right? And about age 53, you'll still have ova. But what happens is all these ova are non-functional. They're not ready, or they're not prepared to turn mature and be ovulated. So when there's no more functional ova, no more ovulation, we call that menopause. It happens at about age 53. That's very different to a male. A male has no sex cells, no spermatozoa until puberty, in which they rapidly produce them, and they make one spermatozoa about every 73 days. So every 73 days, the entire spermatozoa reserve in the testes gets replenished, right? So they constantly make it. And that's why women can't have children after about age 40 without getting serious risk of Down syndrome, genetic disorders because of these faulty eggs, versus males can have children much later in their life, even 50s, etc., because they continually make new spermatozoa. So that's a bit of a distinction. And you could be asked a related question in your exams. Very good. Let's move on. All right. Now let's talk about how hormones are controlled in pregnancy. We've got about 5 minutes left, so we'll go through this quite at a superficial level, but next lesson I'll go through it in much more detail. Okay, so as I said, the master controller is a structure in the brain, right in the center of the brain, right, called the hypothalamus, right there. Hypothalamus. And it will then release hormones that will then go and act on the pituitary gland. Now you need to know the names of those hormones. This is an acronym, and you only need to know the acronym for your exams, but I'm going to tell you its full name. This hormone is called gonad, gonad meaning the testes or the ovary, that's what the gonads are for the male and the female respectively, gonadotropin. Tropin means change. So gonadotropin means act on the ovary, act on the testes, change something. Gonadotropin releasing hormone. So what is this hormone going to do? It's going to go somewhere else and release the hormones that are going to change the gonads. And that's exactly what it does. It'll go to the pituitary and it will cause the release of two gonadotropins, LH and FSH. Again, what does gonadotropin mean, Sarah? Gonadotropin. What does that word mean? Break it down for us.
It's the glands for.
What are the gonads?
I'm not
The,
sure.
the testes or the ovary,
yeah.
right? Those are the gonads. And what does tropin mean? Anyone?
Change.
Change. Very good. So gonadotropin means act on the gonads, the ovary or the testes, and change something. So the two gonadotropins are LH and FSH, these two hormones. I'm going to tell you what they stand for as well. But again, you don't need to remember this stuff. You should know the acronyms, that's it, right? And for FSH, the acronym tells you what it's doing. Follicle stimulating hormone. Matthew, what do you think the follicle stimulating hormone is going to do to the ovary?
Stimulate the release of the follicle.
Exactly. It's going to turn those baby follicles into fully grown follicles to be released, okay, by the ovary. So that's FSH. It tells you what it's going to be doing, okay? And LH is luteinizing hormone, and it will also go act in the gonads. I'll do something else which I'll talk about soon, okay? So then, remember, the pituitary is still in the brain. It's this structure here. What's going to happen then? Just point to your brain, right? The LH and FSH hormones are going to be traveling from the brain through the bloodstream all the way down to the ovaries, which are at the other end of the body, right? It's the gonads for the female or the ovary. And they will cause the release of two hormones. The two hormones are, forget about androgens, that's testosterone, but it's not important for the HSC, estrogen and progesterone. So the LH and FSH will go and travel to the ovary and cause the release of estrogen and progesterone at the ovary. Now, where exactly in the ovary do estrogen and progesterone come from? Britannia? Bit of a hard question.
I'm not sure.
Do you guys remember the follicles? I told you the outer cells of that follicle, right? So again, zoom in here. We're talking about this is one follicle. If I zoom into the follicle and I look at the outer cells, okay, those are the cells that release estrogen and progesterone. Okay, good. All right. Now, for next week, I want you to also research what does estrogen and progesterone do? Why are they important for pregnancy? Okay, so when you come into class and start talking about estrogen and progesterone, I'd like to also for you to do checkpoints D and E. I recall it's on the Teams channel as well. Good. And if you want easy answers, just look at the table underneath. It'll tell you what estrogen and progesterone do. Good. Do you have any questions at all?
So, do you have model answers for the questions for homework?
I will need to check to see if I've got model answers. But mainly the plan is if you want me to review any of the questions and answers, I will jot down and tell you what the key points to have for that answer are. So for example, for a 2-mark question, there's 2 things I'm looking for. 3-mark question, there's 3 things. So I'll go through that and tell you. Okay. So maybe what we'll do next lesson onwards is I'll ask you the specific homework questions, and I'll also tell you the model answers for them. Okay. Good. All right. Well, I will see you guys next week. Have a good week. Think of something interesting you learned in biology when you come back for next lesson, and we'll talk about it. See you guys.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye, Anne. Bye, Atul. Bye, Matthew. Bye, Ed. See you, Sarah.